I was taught it's okay to be the most loud, dominant voice in the room.
And I was always taught that it was expected of me to occupy very little conversational space.
In our 12 and a half years together, we've changed and evolved in a variety of ways. With each change and evolution, we knew we needed to accommodate, adjust, and balance out accordingly.
So over our 12 and a half years together, we've occupied a lot of roles together. We started out as best friends, we eventually got married and became husband and wife, and more recently, we tagged on the label business partners when we opened up our communication consulting firm, Temme Meil. It was this new additional role that really shed light on these implicit messages and lessons that had been infused into us throughout our lives.
And so, like any good husband, wife, psychotherapist, linguist team, we sat down and started to think about how this was going to play out in situations. We started to notice these patterns showing up in meetings.
Essentially, we sat down to have a talk about how we talk. And when we were talking and having these discussions, we kept returning to the idea of androgyny to help us really kind of surpass these communication norms that we had saturated ourselves with.
And we knew that it took some time to understand just where this was going for us, just like anybody. We took our time and talked about our talking so that we could understand where we were and evolve to where we needed to be together.
So androgyny, and what we mean right now by this, is the ambiguous space between masculine and feminine. I, for example, knew I needed to harness a more masculine side of myself in order to feel confident speaking up and out in these conversations.
And I needed to harness more of my feminine side. I needed to step back, have more perspective, ensure harmony, and make sure the voices in the room were being heard across the board.
And so we harnessed our androgyny and we made sure to implement this in our business meetings. How did we do that? We decided on the fact that Neil would ask me direct questions during these meetings. He would look at me and direct the question at me. This would prime him to step back and listen to what came next, and I would be primed to step forward and occupy the space that followed.
This helped us become a lot more satisfied with our meetings in general. Previously, not very satisfying. I was being much more out and about, much more understood and heard. Melissa had a different story.
I would leave these meetings feeling like I hadn't said nearly enough, like I hadn't put my 2 cents in, and like I really hadn't gotten my voice out there. And so this was our solution, the asking and the stepping back of the traditionally dominant voice, and the allowing of another voice to come into the space, very consciously.
We noticed that this was showing up in other ways too after we had that initial conversation. We actually started writing a book together. Initially it was going to be co-authored, but then we realized we were actually writing 2 books that were complementing each other.
Which was okay, because what that did is it allowed both of our voices to shine through in our own individual book, but it also, because they were complementary subject matter and complementary voices, it allowed the other one to come in and fill in those little puzzle pieces when needed. We both got to shine while understanding the power of having that support system behind us.
It literally gave us 2 lanes to think in, relate in, and voice in.
And actually a great analogy for this is the chili we have right here in New Mexico. Some people like red chili, some people like green chili, and some people like a mixture of both, which is Christmas. So just because you like both chilies on your plate doesn't mean that you don't appreciate the flavors of both the red chili and the green chili. What it means is that you understand that each has its own flavor profile and that together they can complement the dish and create a more full, more well-rounded flavor profile, which is exactly what we need to be doing with all of our voices.
You New Mexicans know they're filled with nuance. Those who have traveled here and had the chili also know just how much nuance there is in Albuquerque and across New Mexico. Chile is just the same, and so are we. We have to harness the nuances. We have to create novelty. We have to break out of old ways and move forward together. And we have to use harmony and our masculine voice at the same time.
And so what this nuance does, and what the harnessing and acknowledging of our own androgyny and our own spectrums does, is it allows us to either step forward in conversation and occupy more space if needed, or step back in conversation and hear others as needed. It creates more of a dance of conversation. It's more fluid. It's not so stagnant. It's not so rigid in those prescriptive, traditional gendered roles.
So as you do this psychological dance, notice how much is going on within you and with another. Mind your myths. There's a lot of myths out there about each side of this spectrum of androgyny, of being masculine and being feminine. Pay attention to what comes up in you and pay attention to what's coming up in the other. Find ways to meet each other where you're at consciousness-wise, individually and collectively.
And so while you're doing this, give yourself permission to see your spectrums. Allow yourself to occupy those spaces so you can step forward when needed in conversation in order to be heard and have your voice amplified. But so you also know when to step back in conversation and hear others and let them occupy that space. Let it be a dance. What this means is that if we allow ourselves to see and feel our own spectrums and see the spectrums of others and where they're stepping, just because you identify as traditionally masculine or more traditionally feminine does not necessarily mean that those are the conversational roles that you have to occupy 100% of the time. So what we want to ask you is this. Ask yourself, what are my voices? Where are my voices? Go find them.